Good morning. It's been quite a ride in the ethanol biofuels business overall, but especially so for me at Northeast Biofuels in Fulton. As Jim said, there has been a lot of attention, both in New York State and regionally in the Northeast with what we've got going on, and we expect to have more as we work our way through the transition that Jim spoke of. What I want to do is give a bit of an overview of the recent history of the industry and where the industry is headed now. Talk a bit about Northeast Biofuels, the genesis of the idea, what brought us to Fulton, New York at the Old Miller Brewery. Talk a bit about the perfect storm, as we call it. We found ourselves in the midst of a number of dynamics converging that put us in the situation of having to declare and file Chapter 11, but see this really as an opportunity to take the plant where we'd intended to take it to begin with to full production, being the largest ethanol producer in the Northeast, and then a bit about the future and where we're going to head to. During the period of 2005 and 2008, we saw in the corn-based ethanol industry, severe growth with literally dozens of plants being constructed at the same time over the period of 2005 and 2008. This was brought about as a result of overnight, unheard of potential opportunity for profitability with corn-based ethanol, where previously the margins had always been thin to the point of not making it commercially viable. So overnight, with the price of gasoline, with petroleum becoming more scarce and the market becoming such that the prices were increasing almost on a daily or if not an hourly basis, corn-based ethanol became commercially viable. The payback of new facilities being constructed was very short, and there was a literal rush to construct overnight. At the time, financial markets were healthy. There was money being thrown at the construction of new facilities, primarily in the Midwest, and primarily the start of these new facilities were agribusinesses, farmers that brought together cooperatives, joined where they had previously focused their attention and their energy on growing corn for use in the agricultural business for feed, primarily for large beef operations in the Midwest, South, and Southeast, to overnight becoming energy providers. Quickly, the industry saw that overcapacity was built. There was a large demand for the raw materials, particularly stainless steel, which is used very much in the construction of ethanol plants. The price of stainless steel, along with at the time the price of oil and the price of gasoline, put the producers and those that were looking to become producers by constructing plants to the point where many never finished the construction of the facilities. There are literally dozens of plants right now shuttered, either in a partial state of completion or complete and never started. As a result of the declining markets, these facilities have shut down and represent an opportunity for other larger companies to aggregate and see economies of scale as the facilities sit there waiting to be operated. As well, you would expect, like we experienced, the large significant investment, and for the Northeast Biofuels facility, it was somewhere in the neighborhood of $200 million, goes from a $200 million mortgage to literally cents on the dollar for those that are acquiring the plants, looking at bringing them back into operation. Sorry. In 2008, we saw record production with the plants that were completed and brought online. Approximately 170 operating refineries across 26 states, again, primarily in the Midwest. In 2009, the renewable fuels industry claims that there will be an additional volume brought online to bring it to a record production of about 10.5 billion gallons this year, representing nearly 9% of the demand for fuel in the country. Along with this, and most people don't realize that the ethanol industry really is truly an agribusiness. Ethanol is a co-product or a byproduct of a grain processing facility. We bring in number 2 yellow corn, kernels only, and process the corn in a way where we pull the fermentables so we can create the ethanol, and on the output side have what is really a higher quality than directly off the field material, feedstock for the agricultural business. Along with the growth of the technology, as you would expect, there's been a lot of work in the agricultural technology business to look at ways to improve the yield of corn per acre, the ways to use more arid soils and regions for the development of corn and the growth of the feedstock necessary for ethanol. So the growth period that we had multiple effects on not just the fuels industry and the energy industry. It's created a significant investment in the technology overall and what is happening. As Jim said, my background was in nuclear power before coming to the biofuels business. Spent over 20 years, traveled to Japan, Sweden, France, Germany, and was likely in about a third of the United States commercial nuclear reactors. Quickly found after becoming involved in the biofuels business that a biorefinery is more complicated technologically than a nuclear power plant. You have on the front end a living machine through the fermentation. You have thermodynamics and chemistry through the distillation and the material separation. And more importantly, or more significantly, is the logistics necessary to operate a facility, especially a 100 million gallon facility like the one we have in Fulton. So what's happened through the growth of the ethanol industry is it has spurred a lot of investment in furthering the myriad of technologies associated with the operation of and the development of biorefineries for improvement in efficiency and overall operation and contribution to the energy needed in the country. Along with that, obviously, there's been a very significant collaboration that's been spurred between industry and academia. We have, at Northeast Biofuels, spent considerable time speaking with folks like Jim, folks from Cornell, SUNY ESF, many of the universities in the region to talk about where we're going, what our initial plans are to bring the refinery into operation, and then what are the next steps. We recognize that corn-based ethanol has a lifespan. It's not the end, and it's not the end answer. Our facility is uniquely constructed, given that we have 24 fermenters from the original brewery. We feel makes it uniquely suitable for conversion over time to a cellulosic or another technology. Obviously, the ethanol business has had a significant impact on growth, especially in rural regions. In the Midwest, the direct employment as well as the cast-off jobs associated with the technology, with the growing of the feedstock, the corn, the machinery, the equipment, and all the different aspects that go into operating a biorefinery has had a significant impact on rural economics. With the discussion that's gone on over the last few years, as a result of the tight supply and the high price of energy, and the debate that's gone on with regard to the viability of corn-based ethanol as a contributor to offset the volatility of the market, the public's become much more aware of the complexities of what our energy supply chain and what it takes to have a stable supply of energy, what's involved. I think ethanol, along with creating the dramatic increase in the investment in technology, has gone a long ways towards educating the public and sensitizing the public to the point that the same old way, same old is not acceptable going in the future. That options are necessary, and we look to develop them with corn-based ethanol as a starting point. As we said, Northeast Biofuels started after two gentlemen from the Cazenovia area purchased the Miller Brewery campus. The brewery was constructed in the late 70s and operated for about 15 years. During that period of time, as you recall, Miller Lite was probably the standard on the market. In the late 80s, Budweiser came on the scene with Bud Light. If you remember the dueling beer bottles during the football halftime, Miller found itself with the Fulton facility, a facility in Atlanta, Georgia, and a facility in Ohio that was a brand new facility, found themselves overbuilt with the onset of the competition that Budweiser represented. So they had to shut one of the three plants down. They chose Fulton. Tom Denny and Eric Will purchased the facility from Miller with the initial intent of scrapping out the brew house, which is constructed primarily of stainless steel. And at the time, the stainless steel market was very high. They brought in a world-known investment auctioneering firm that specialized in brewing operations. They tagged and inventoried every nut and bolt of the facility, and schedule an auction to take place. Unfortunately, it was scheduled for about a week after 9/11 occurred. So the auction went bust. They then said, okay, what do we do now? Because the campus is huge, and they had obviously a significant investment just sitting, growing weeds. They came up with the idea and was approached by a gentleman from the Albany area about some sort of a biorefinery. Long story short, consultants brought to bear. They enjoined with the initial parent company of Northeast Biofuels, a company called Permalex International that operated biorefineries in northwestern Canada. Came to bear, they joined and signed an engineer procure construct agreement with a company out of Memphis, Tennessee called Lurgy to retrofit the facility and bring it into operation. One of the key drivers in being able to put together a pro forma to get the financing for the facility had to do with not only that the infrastructure was there, and technologically it looked as though the infrastructure was suitable for a retrofit, but it was determined that the Northeast was especially a good location for a large biorefinery ethanol plant. It was called the destination model. There's approximately 2.4 billion gallons per year of ethanol consumed in the Northeast, which includes New York, Connecticut, New Jersey, Massachusetts, New Hampshire, and Maine. Along with the large demand that's focused in the Northeast, it was recognized that the facility is located within a 250-mile radius of one of the largest concentrations of agriculture, especially dairy, in the Northeast. New York State is the third largest dairy producer in the country, and the Fulton facility is located in the heart of that area. Recognizing that the primary product that is put out from the plant is Distillers Grains, it made it very suitable for that location to be viable. Along with that, the facility is located on a CSX main spur. We're about 10 miles to the south of Port of Oswego, where they're developing and increasing the development of large-scale barge traffic down the St. Lawrence and overseas to Europe. Again, one of the largest markets for Distillers Grains is Europe, so we saw that as an opportunity given that location. The demographics in Oswego County are such that employment is weak. There are many talented individuals available to us to bring to bear to employ at the plant. All of the individuals that we eventually did hire, and at the peak we were at 67, were Central New Yorkers. I believe the furthest away was our production manager, came from actually this area. He grew up in Chilai. So all the employees were from the Fulton, Oswego, and Northern Onondaga County area. And again, as I mentioned earlier, we also saw it very attractive from a geographic location, the other resources available, especially through the academic community, that we would eventually bring to bear to talk about how we would go about, as soon as the plant reached steady state operation, optimization activities, and in parallel, how we could leverage the academic efforts that were going on to develop cellulosic and other alternative feedstocks for the facility. So overall, the destination model, both from the standpoint of economics and the market, was a good location. So our engineer procure construct contract was signed in May of 2006, and Lurgy was brought on board initially to come into the facility and perform demolition, where they essentially stripped the pre-existing mechanical, electrical control systems, basically gutted the brew house, leaving in place the tanks that were used by Miller to brew beer, so that they could be repiped, new piping, pumps, electronics, and controls to make and we call it beer as well, to make the beer that we use to distill to eventually have the alcohol. Difference being our beer, when complete, is about 13 to 14, if we're doing a good job, % alcohol, much stronger than the Miller Lite would have been. So construction began in 2006. As I mentioned earlier, the boom period for ethanol was between 2005 2008. We found ourselves trying to make the retrofit of the plant right in the heart of that boom period for ethanol facility construction. As I said, stainless steel prices doubled, tripled, and in some cases quadrupled. The supply of some of the specialty equipment that we needed became rare and hard to get. The prices, again, go up. The engineering firms involved in the design and construction of ethanol facilities were fairly limited. There are about 4 to 6 that specialize in the design of ethanol facilities. So the engineering talent necessary was very quickly soaked up across the dozens and dozens of plants that were being constructed at the time. The designer that we hired found themselves in a situation where they could not keep up with the design schedule necessary to meet the construction schedule. So we had experienced delays in the design and the construction of the facility. It was expected to take about 18 months from start to finish in full production. We found ourselves about a year behind schedule, but ultimately began testing of the facility in August of 2008. Now, if you think back of August in 2008, gas prices were approaching $4 a gallon. At the same time, corn, our pro forma expected corn to be somewhere in the neighborhood of $3.50 a bushel. During the period of time that we were finally able to begin testing the plant and consuming corn, we were buying corn anywhere between $6 and $10 a bushel. Natural gas, again, our pro forma, was about $2.50 per unit. At the time we began our testing, it was pushing 13. So now natural gas is through the roof, corn is through the roof, and petroleum is through the roof. The bulk of our corn comes from the Midwest, about 70% of it. We expect to develop 30 to 40% local origination from local farmers. But again, because the bulk of it at the time was coming from the Midwest, the cost of oil for the transportation via CSX also went through the roof. So our pro forma was upside down. Feedstock and energy was orders of magnitude more expensive than what we'd expected when the plan was put together. That issue was then confounded with problems that we had with testing of the facility. But we're consuming corn at a very large rate. It's almost 6,000 bushels an hour, using somewhere in the neighborhood of $250,000 to $300,000 worth of natural gas a month, about 2/3 of that electricity, and not getting the yield from each bushel of corn that we were consuming because of design issues with the facility. So the stars converged in a bad way, and we found ourselves in a situation where the cash that we had available through the construction loan that had been developed to support the plant, although the plant was very fully funded, we found ourselves short and had to eventually file for Chapter 11 on January 14th. The sale to Sunoco closed on June 15th, just a few months ago. As I said earlier, there was about a $200 million investment in the facility. Sunoco picked the plant up for $8.5 million. Significant difference in the overhead costs for them to operate the plant. As we were in the midst of trying to understand what was wrong with our facility, we had engaged what is the premier design build ethanol firm in the United States, ICM, to come in and look at what was going on and to help us. Fast forward, Sunoco now on board. Sunoco has fully engaged ICM to undertake an engineering study and to develop design modifications necessary for the plant to operate so that we can get the yield from the corn that we consume. Right now we're in the final stages of finalizing the scope of that design. The modifications involve primarily reconfiguring what we call the front end of the plant, the biological aspect of the plant, to eliminate dead legs and shortcomings in the way that the piping was configured that contributed to bacterial infection as we were building the fermentation to create the 14% beer. Bacteria would, it's always present. It would thrive in dead legs in the piping. The piping was also configured in a way where we were not able to clean it. We have what's called a CIP, clean in place system, so that between each batch of fermenters being finished, it is drained and sent to the distillation plant. We perform a CIP, a hot caustic wash and rinse, to eliminate all the remaining organic material in the piping. The plant was constructed in a way where we weren't effective in our ability to clean the pipes. So bacteria would take hold and would thrive and ultimately compete with the yeast because they enjoy the same environment that the yeast enjoy, and would impact the yield, eventually getting to the point where organic acetic and lactic acids would build as a result of the bacteria as well, and the plant would struggle. So the modification, scoping of the modifications is underway. We're in the process of finalizing that. We expect to be in a position where we can resume the startup operation near the end of the first quarter of next year. So people would ask, why Sunoco? Well, obviously they got a bargain for the plant at $8.5 million. But Sunoco has a pretty extensive history in the alternative fuels business. Reading some notes Early on, 1989, they were involved in the distribution of M85. They've been involved in the 90s in the retail distribution and use of propane as a motor fuel, primarily in the Boston and Virginia areas. They were involved in the use and commercial retail sale of compressed natural gas for motor fuel. They've been involved in and selling E10, which is an ethanol gasoline blend in the Ohio, Michigan area for more than 12 years. And then recently, they've been involved in installing infrastructure, selling and distributing E85 in the Northeast, primarily along the Pennsylvania Turnpike and in areas of Indiana, Michigan, North Carolina, New York, Ohio, and Pennsylvania. So Sunoco has had a long history of exploring how to find alternatives and to make commercially viable alternatives to the conventional RBOB gasoline motor fuel. They obviously recognize the value of the Fulton plant based on the purchase price, but also, again, based on the geographic location of the Fulton plant is in the heart of Sunoco's marketing and distribution network region. For those of you that are from this area, you go down just about any side road through many of the small towns here in upstate, western, and central New York, and on any corner that is a gas station, it's typically a Sunoco station. So they expect to be able to consume and distribute the product, the 100 million gallons per year that we will produce, throughout their network of the stations that are here in western, central New York. They have a very large corridor of retail distribution. They call it the I-81 corridor that goes from Canada south through New York into Pennsylvania. They recognize also that the location of the facility and the size of the facility, there's huge opportunity for future growth. The first step is to get the plant fixed, to get the plant operating, and to provide the 100 million gallons a year that they can fully sop up within the Sunoco demand network. Right now, Sunoco is consuming about 500 million gallons a year in the network that they have. So we'll provide about 25% of what they currently consume in the heart of the region that they distribute it. And lastly, the effort of being involved in biofuels and ethanol is becoming a trend in the industry. Valero, which is another large petroleum refiner and distributor, purchased half a dozen, 6 to 8 plants from a company called Verisun that at the time, 2 years ago, 3 years ago, was the largest ethanol producer in the country. They found themselves in a situation about a year ago when the commodities markets were in the extreme of volatility. They had a risk management program that had them buy futures of corn in very large volumes at very high prices, and when the market crashed, found themselves extended in the hundreds of millions of dollars to the point where they went bankrupt, and Valero bought about a third of the plants that they own. So now you have 2 to 3 of the large conventional petroleum refiners and distributors stepping into ethanol production to eliminate that middle step and hopefully add some additional margin to the bottom line. This is the campus. I'll step around over here. North is to the left. This is the main CSX spur. Goes to the port of Oswego. This is the brewing operation that Miller would have used. The administration building was here, and then this area here was packaging and handling, where they would line up the trucks with the finished product and take it to market. When Northeast Biofuels came to be, the property was actually subdivided right along the edge of the brew house here. So Northeast Biofuels property now runs along this parking lot and then down to County Route 57. This is the Oswego Barge Canal, over to a road that's called Owen Road, which is here, and then we encompass the rail yard. This is a bit of a dated picture. The rail yard was extensively changed. We now have somewhere approximately 6.5 miles worth of track on the property. Very extensive ladder track system is parked up here now. Over in the right-hand corner, again, not yet shown in this picture, is a Linde CO2 plant. We capture the CO2 off of the fermentation process, put it through scrubbers on our side of the facility, where it's piped over on pipe racks to the Lindy facility. They put it through some additional high efficiency scrubbers, and in the end they have food grade and medical grade CO2, which is loaded onto rail cars or trucks and goes again primarily downstate New York and New Jersey for carbonating beverages and in the medical industry. So our feedstock, our corn, when not coming in by truck, will come in by CSX from the Midwest in 90-car unit trains. CSX drops the 90-car trains in the ladder track system, where we take the cars, break them into 22-car sets, bring them around through the rail shed, we call it, where we now have a new rail spur located in this area here. The corn then is delivered through bottom drop of the rail cars into silos, into a milling building, and then into the brew house, where we begin the mash preparation to start the fermentation process. One of the things that you hear often about ethanol, as far as the minus, is the consumption of water that an ethanol plant demands. We are located on a water main that runs again along the CSX spur, pulls directly from Lake Ontario. So water demand for us is not an issue. We're not tapping local wells and lowering the water table, doing any of those issues. Also, the plant, by design, is what's called a zero discharge plant. So any of the water that we intake for the purpose of creating the mash, after the process runs its cycle, and I'll go into more detail in a minute, is cleaned, reclaimed, and reintroduced to the front end. So we have no overboard, no processed water leaves the site. The only water that we have that leaves the site is blowdown from our cooling tower and boilers, which is clean water with water treatment chemicals in it for antimicrobial and to keep it clean. So we have no processed water that goes overboard. Unlike Miller, where every gallon of what they would have consumed for brewing purposes went through a very large wastewater treatment plant and then ultimately found its way into the river. Yes? We do, and I'll show you. I've got some better pictures that'll show you some of the detail as to what it looks like now. This is our process. So if we start up here on the left, we bring in number 2 yellow, dent, kernels only, dried to no more than 16.5% moisture. It is brought in, again, by rail, by truck. We have 2 500,000 bushel silos that we store the corn in. The 500,000 bushels at full production, or excuse me, the million bushels at full production will last us about 7 days. It goes into we have 3 dry hammer mills. So the corn kernels are fed via conveyor into the 3 hammer mills, where we create a corn flour. It looks just like flour. From that, it is carried by conveyors into a process where we prepare the flour by putting it through a series of chemical breakdown with the application of enzymes, mechanical with jet cookers, and then liquefaction, which is time with additional enzymes to break the starches down into more simple sugars for the yeast to consume. We also then take the prepared mash and introduce it with the yeast. We have a process where we bring in dry yeast. It comes in bales about a foot square. We hydrate it, we add nutrients, and then introduce the mash, propagate it, bring the yeast back to life, verify that they are viable and healthy and robust, and then introduce them to the fermenters, of which we have 24. They work in batches of 4, so it's a continuous batch process. Each fermenter is 277,000 gallons. We are always either filling, fermenting, draining, or cleaning a batch. So as you could imagine, scheduling is very important, with especially the large volumes of material that we're dealing with. We ferment for about 50 hours, bring it to, if all of the parameters are what they need to be, meaning temperature, pH, the right nutrients, no more than a certain amount of organic acids. We will have a 13.5 to 14% by volume beer, along with the CO2 that we produce, which is captured and sent to the CO2 plant. The fermented beer then comes to what we call a beer well. It's basically a large head tank that feeds the distillation plant. So we go from the biological aspect in fermentation to now the distillation process, where it's largely thermodynamics, where we put the 13.5% alcohol through a series of evaporator columns and concentrate the alcohol, ultimately getting it to 200 proof. So when you hear people say DD&E, dehydration, distillation, and evaporation. So we distill it, then we evaporate the whole stillage, we pull off a syrup from the stillage after the alcohol has been extracted. The syrup is applied to the distillers grains and are routed to large dryers. We have two large, Bar-Rosine is the manufactured ring dryers, where we take the stillage after it's processed through a series of centrifuges. We separate the liquids from the solids, apply syrup off of the evaporators, dry it, and it's ready for market. The plant was configured, and actually the configuration was changed from the original design. In the original design, the facility had thermal oxidizers and heat recovery steam generators. Thermal oxidizers pulling the off gas or the hot air that is created by the drying process that is high in VOC content, and the thermal oxidizers basically destruct via high temperature, 12 to 1500 degrees, the VOCs from the off gas. The original design reclaimed that heat, or a portion of that heat, created steam, which was then used on the front end of the process. We recognized after we started to look at the demographics in the area a little bit more where we were, and recognizing that we had about 650,000 head of dairy cattle within the 200-mile radius of the plant, recognized that there was an opportunity for us to not have to use the dryers exclusively, but to put out either what is called a wet cake product, meaning it's the product that comes directly off the centrifuges at about 70% moisture, or a modified, which is about 50%. Either way, you're not expending the natural gas, you're not emitting the VOCs to the thermal oxidizers. It's a good all the way around. It gives us more margin, and it provides a better environmental footprint. The design of the plant, as it was constructed with the thermal oxidizers, was carbon neutral. So what we did is we changed the design and actually went to a regenerative thermal oxidizer design and package boilers. So what that does for us is with the package boilers, if we can create the market, and we expect that we can, and put out almost exclusively wet distillers grains to the local farmers, leave the dryers off, we improve that footprint and our margins even further. So we have the package boilers to generate the steam. We don't need the dryers through the heat recovery steam generators because we've separated the two. And we can have a premium product going to the farmers via wet, reduce the dependence in the use of natural gas, and also improve our carbon footprint both ways. So, ferment, 13.5% beer well, concentrate the alcohol to 200 proof. We put the 200 proof alcohol, and this is the E and the EDD&E. This is, the D, this is dehydration, where we remove through two large molecular sieves any of the remaining moisture that is brought forward with the alcohol. So when we're done, it is very, 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 very dry. That alcohol goes into day tanks where we accumulate in 200,000 gallon batches, pull samples, do assays, make sure that they meet all the standards and specifications. Assuming everything is good, we then take that material into our final product tanks where we add denaturant, which is gasoline, at 1%, and that's literally to ruin the taste. So we're not putting out alcohol to the locals, and ATTB will leave us alone. So we add the gasoline to ruin the taste, put it in our final product tanks, and it's ready for load out via either rail cars or trucks. After the alcohol has been pulled from the stillage, as I said, it goes into centrifuges where we separate the solids from the liquids. The liquids go forward into evaporators where we pull out the solubles that are in the liquid. Solubles become syrup. Syrup is applied to the wet cake and goes out with the wet cake, or it goes through the dryers. The remaining water, after the solubles have been pulled, goes through an anaerobic treatment module, an anaerobic treatment system. We then use the anaerobic treatment system to remove any of the remaining organics and acids that would have been carried forward. We clean that water, purify it, and make it suitable then for reintroduction in the front end of the plant. Future ideas that we're working on, and had we not had to go through the issues we went through, we had a contract in place and had a schedule for equipment to have been delivered in January for a corn oil extraction system. What the corn oil extraction system will do is, after we have, and actually it'll come off in two stages. One stage comes off on the front, another stage on the back near distillation. We pull a side stream of the mash off of the system, put it through an additional set of cook and centrifuge, oil out of the mash. That corn oil is then used with other chemicals as a feedstock to create biodiesel. The size of our facility and the design of the system that we were to install would have yielded about 10 million gallons of biodiesel a year, in addition to the 100 million gallons of ethanol. As I mentioned, we also have a co-product called CO2. We have the distillers grains, we have the ethanol, and eventually we will have, and Sunoco intends on furthering and moving forward with this, have the corn oil. Any questions on that? Yeah.
Hi, Judy Fitzpatrick. What percentage of your profit that comes out, or of the money you make, comes from ethanol, and what percentage comes from the other byproducts? Ethanol
is about 30% of the total. The distillers grains actually is what carries the plant. The ethanol, this is really our core product, is the distillers grains. The ethanol and the CO2 are byproducts.
So when you see a lot of people saying that grass is a much better source of ethanol because it's a lot cheaper, then they're not considering the other byproducts that come out of the corn. Is that correct?
Absolutely correct. The naysayers for corn-based ethanol do not typically recognize, although our plant is atypical in that we capture the CO2. Most of the Midwest plants do not capture CO2. So that is the different product streams that we have help give us, that broader stance of margins as the different markets fluctuate. And the naysayers do not typically recognize the fact, for plants that capture CO2, that your carbon footprint is neutral or negative if you move to a point where you're using something other than natural gas to drive your front end and to drive your dryers, which we're also looking at. They don't recognize, in the food versus fuel debate, the fact that the end product here, when ready for market, is actually a better product for the farmers from the standpoint of transportation and from the standpoint of the animal nutritionist's ability to blend it to get the biggest return on the dollar spent for the feed to the animals.
So if people went to a grass-based ethanol production, would they actually be able to get byproducts out of that too? I mean, you had said you could convert this plant in the future sometime.
There are co-products that are available through cellulosic. The one that I am most familiar with, and the one that we've explored the most, is a product called lignin that comes off of woody-based cellulosic process. And what we had explored and still have on the table now, once we have the plant addressed, is to install a biomass, either gasification process and or a process where we would take the lignin off of the front end process and feed a cogeneration, a boiler, create electricity, create steam for the front end of the process, and create the layers that way. We've talked to Mascoma is the name that people recognize in this region. We've had several meetings with Mascoma about that idea, along with Constellation Energy for the cogeneration aspect of it.
Okay, thank you. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Hi, Linda McMaster Schuyler. Is the market for the West Distillers Grains mostly in the Northeast? Or do you ship any of this stuff back out to the Midwest?
The difference is between the three products. You have WDGS, wet distillers grains with solubles, and the DDGS, dry distillers grains with solubles. The key difference between those two products is shelf life. The wet material, especially in the summertime, has a shelf life of somewhere between 7 and 10 days, depending upon how you prepare it. We've looked at our ability to apply propionic acid and other things that help to control, growth, mold, and things on the material. But the wet distillers grains is a local product for that reason. Where the dry distillers grains, we actually, when we were operating, loaded it exclusively into rail cars, and most of that went to New Orleans and was loaded on barges and went to Europe. Right now, New York State is, for those farmers, and many of the large, and I'm talking, farms that are 600 head, 1,000 head, are using distillers grains. New York State is predominantly an import state. So the market, because of the magnitude, and I'll show you some numbers here in a minute so you get a sense for the volumes that we produce, the market here will change overnight. And we really don't know how that change will develop. But when we come online and we're producing product at the quality and the consistency that we need to produce so that the farmers will buy it, the market here and the numbers will change. We think, not only to the benefit of us, but we think it will have a significant potential opportunity for agriculture, especially beef and dairy, probably dairy and beef in that order, in New York State. Because the product will be of a superior quality, because of transportation, potential savings in transportation costs, additional margin should be available, not only for us, but for the buyers. So we think it could be a win-win for everybody. Yes. Well, and that's really going to be driven on, the acres available. And I don't recall the numbers off the top of my head, so I'm a bit at risk in saying this, but in the last 2 years, I seem to recall that the acres grown in the 200-mile radius that we would pull from went up in the neighborhood of 35 to 40%. And we know, again, I don't know if you're from around this area, but if you drive from here to Watertown, up through Jefferson County, there are still many, many, many thousands of acres that at one time were, actively farmed in dairy primarily in this region that are there waiting to go back to work. So, yeah, right now the numbers, we think we could get up to 30% locally. That could grow. And we want to get as much locally as we can because that's margin for us, and it has a positive impact to the agricultural community here in central New York, or upstate New York.
Sonia Wallman, I agree with Judy. I mean, this story should get out more about, the actual process economics of all this, and how I think now. You changed my mind about corn, actually.
Well, one thing I would suggest, too, there's a website, Renewable Fuels Association, rfa.org, I believe it is, and they have a lot of good information that goes towards the debates that are out there: food versus fuel, water, CO2 footprint, greenhouse gas emissions, et cetera, et cetera. But you're right, like any other energy industry, if you're talking about nuclear, you're talking about corn-based ethanol, whatever, it's education. Yeah.
And along the same lines as education, we are into this group training, educating and training students to basically understand how to use various cells to grow products, and really focusing on the biopharmaceutical proteins right now, but recognizing that we have these crossover industries. So, and we want to serve you guys. So we've got 3 what we call core production systems. One uses E. coli, Escherichia coli, and we're going to be showing this off today and tomorrow and Thursday. And then we have one that is CHO cell, which is the mammalian cell of the industry. But we have one that we started in 1994 at my school, and pretty much a lot of people poo-pooed it, as we were trying to develop something here in our group for, and it's a yeast, Pichia pastoris, which is becoming very important for the biopharmaceutical industry. So I'm thinking that we should all be using the Pichia pastoris core production system because it's much more relevant to the crossover industries. And actually, my question is, what's the genus and species of the yeast that you use for fermentation and the organisms that you're using for anaerobic treatment? I mean, if you can say anything about that.
What species we're using?
Yeah, what genus and species of yeast, and I suppose you're using yeast for the anaerobic treatment as well? Yeah.
It's a bacteria.
Bacteria.
Right.
Can you kind of give us,
Not really, no. Because there's a lot, for two reasons. It's not my area of expertise, and there's some sensitivity in the industry overall, because there are some, that's where a lot of investment has gone, is both in the yeast, obviously more so than the bacteria that's used for anaerobic treatment. But
can you just tell us the genus of the yeast? No?
Nah.
Pichia, you know.
It's not a lot different than what you see used in the alcohol industry.
And so they
for
must
wine and beer.
Brewer's yeast?
Yes.
It's brewer's yeast.
Basically.
Yeah. So what's that? Saccharomyces yeast?
Yes, it is.
Okay. Cool. But it doesn't really much matter if you're growing yeast. You know, you get the picture, because the growth rate and whatever they're doing.
Absolutely. Yeah, okay. Well, I can divert her, because here's something else that's going on in the industry, and I'm just now becoming exposed to it. As we look at ways to, again, create product streams off of these facilities to create margin, and I am just now getting exposed. In fact, my process manager, she received her master's degree from Cornell in the yeast tolerance of tolerance of yeast in an ethanol environment. So she and I met with a gentleman on Friday of last week, where we're now looking at, once we get the plant up and running, possibly either eliminating this or putting this in a standby mode, pulling a stream off here, putting it through an aerobic system that utilizes a bacteria that is used as a key element in blending of certain feedstocks for the dairy industry. That process would allow us to consume all of the syrup, and will consume all of the organic acids that may exist in the process at this point, and provide another 70%. It'll increase the value of the grains coming out here, he tells us, about 70%, because of both the defatting and the process that we put through to clean and remove the syrup. So there are other opportunities there, using different types of biological processes than what we currently have in play. So there's more going on, along with, you know, gasification of cellulosic material.
Ed Bine. Related to species, I've read research about using different biological organisms to create branch chain and longer chain hydrocarbons. Are you doing any work in that?
Not yet. No, but we have had some discussion with some folks at SUNY ESF.
So that's in the pipeline somewhere.
Again, our number one objective now is to get this baby going.
Yeah, sure.
Create some revenue, see where the market goes, and then optimize.
Peter Schaefer, Hudson Valley. How many people do you employ in your QA labs? And what level of education do they have?
Yeah. We are, again, atypical, because we have 24 fermenters, where a typical 100 million gallon plant would have 3 to 5 very large vessels for fermentation. We have 24. 25 if you count a finished fermenter. We had 15 people in the lab when we were operating. As I said, Erin Brown, who's our process engineering manager, is responsible for the lab. She has a master's degree from Cornell. Her lab manager was 5 or 6 hours away from her doctorate. The other lab technicians that we have, at a minimum, have 2-year degree. We have a couple that have 4-year degrees. Primarily biochemistry. One of the things that we found when we went out and began our recruiting, during the period of time that we were recruiting, was the period of time where Bristol Myers in Syracuse was having a downsizing and reorganization. And we were able to pull resource from them to assist us in, to populate our lab. As well, we have Budweiser has a brewery in Baldwinsville, New York, which is only 8 or 9 miles away, and we were able to pull some resources from them as well. The lab is one of our challenges because of the number of fermenters we have. We are literally pulling, I'm going to have to swag it, over a 24-hour period, I would say 60 different samples are pulled and processed through the lab. And that would include, we verify density and starch in our mash. We pull and verify yeast count and viability from our yeast propagation. We pull and verify pH, organic acids, sugars from fermentation, and yeast and fermentation in the early stages. So in the first, I think it's the first 6 hours of propagation and the first 12 hours of fermentation, we're pulling samples every hour. We have HPLC and NIR. We actually have, when we started out, we had one HPLC. When we were in the midst of going through the challenges that we had and trying to really get a handle on the data and the numbers to figure out, what was going on, we ended up buying 3 more. We have 4 HPLCs in our lab, which is unheard of anywhere, any other ethanol plant.
Maybe for the sake of time, we can maybe Brian can finish up the talk.
Do that? Yep. Production numbers. The design basis of the plant said that we would run 353 days a year, and the remaining days would be used for scheduled shutdowns, cleaning. 100 million gallons a year. Again, we fully expect, based on the way the plant is configured, to reach 114 with the existing equipment we have without a lot of optimization. The bulk of the stretch from 100 to 114 will be in fermentation. Really, fermentation is where it is at if you're talking about the process. CO2 production, 807 tons per day. DDGS, 914 tons per day. That is a lot. We could fill this building in less than a week. Cord feed rate, 101,556 bushels a day. We're feeding about 65, well, you can do the math, like 62, 76 an hour. We can load ethanol. We have a truck load out and a rail load out. Rail load out, we can load 750 gallons a minute. That's 4 rail cars simultaneously, and we can load about 600 gallons a minute at our truck load out. Here's some pictures. This is the entrance, the commercial entrance off of Owen Road, truck scale. So if we're bringing in truck corn, it would come in here and then around to this building here. This is our grain receiving building. You can't really see it because there's a piece of equipment in the way, but there are 3 overhead doors here. The one farthest to the right is where trucks enter. They drop the corn out of the bottom. There's a conveyor system below ground that then brings it into an elevator. Elevator brings it up here, and then it's deposited in one of these 2 silos. The silos then have an additional set of conveyors that bring it to the surge bin, and the surge bin then feeds the hammer mill. This is the east side of the plant looking west. This is the brew house. This is the beer well that feeds the distillation plant. These are the fermenters. They're 24. And then on the other side of the beer well, which you can't see, is what's called a finished fermenter. So we bring the corn in, process it, ferment it, finished fermenter, beer well to the distillation plant. Finished product then comes into, these are the molecular sieves. We pull the moisture out, and then it comes into these 2 day tanks. Feed 1 tank at a time. While one is isolated for testing, the other one's being filled, and then it comes out on a pipe rack and into the storage tanks, which I'll show you in a second. It's an old picture inside the brew house where when construction was underway, and they're using one of the old brew kettles. Just another picture on the right of the fermenters. This is the distillation plant. Here's the beer column, rectification column. Here is the finished fermenter, beer well, day tanks, and these are our finished product tanks. These are 1 million gallons each. So we take the ethanol, once we pulled the sample and tested it, confirm that it's good, it's then piped out to these 2 tanks. On its way, we introduce the 1% gasoline. This is a picture of the ring dryers. There are 2 ring dryers, one here, one here. So on the back side of the plant, as I said earlier, we do the fermentation. We get the 13.5% alcohol. We concentrate the alcohol in the distillation plant. Once the alcohol's been pulled, it then comes over to this building where we have 6 flat wag centrifuges, horizontal centrifuges. We separate the solids from the liquids. Liquids get sent back through anaerobic treatment to the front of the plant, and the solids get sent over here. If we're going to dry them, they go through these dryers. Basically, you have hot boxes here and a large plenum. It's basically an air duct where we introduce 850-degree air with very large blowers. We feed the grain into the blowers, and then by the time it makes this trip up and around the duct, it goes from about 70% to 10% moisture. Goes on a conveyor, and then into this building. This part of the building here is where our wet cake is stored. It's got overhead cover, but no sides on it. And then farther to the right, which you can't see in this picture, is an enclosed building where we store the dry distillers grains. This is the end of the fermenter string and the pipe rack. Over here is the gas plant, where we would send the CO2 via a large blower. It goes into this building where they have compressors and scrubbers, where they pull any of the remaining contaminants that would go in the feed gas out of the CO2, compress it, liquefy it, store it in these tanks, where it can then be sent over to this area where we have a loadout rack. On one side we load ethanol, the other side we load CO2 into rail cars. So, our plan, complete the design development. We hope to be able to mobilize our contractors sometime mid-fall, complete the modifications, and then move into a flush and hydro test. The plant, we do a very extensive pre-start safety review and process hazard analysis for the portions of the system that we call in scope. In scope is basically anything that is higher than a 10% alcohol concentration. We do a very thorough and adequate process hazard analysis. And then we get into a first grind, do our performance testing, and then reach steady state operation. As soon as we have reached steady state operation, and we're actually now already starting to outline plans, as soon as steady state operation is reached, we then move into optimization. So, keys to success, not just for us, but the industry, right? We've got to maximize the value of the existing products. And we're looking at, in the future, when we get into optimization, of ways not only to create the products that we currently create in a more effective and efficient way, but also to further apply technology to improve the environmental footprint. Look at improvements in production efficiency, as I said. Look at alternatives to fossil fuel for production. We rely right now on natural gas for running the boilers, to make the steam, to prepare the mash, and for heating the dryers to dry the wet cake into dry distillers grains with solubles. We're looking at ways to be able to offset that reliance upon natural gas by either biomass, biogas, gasification, and other technologies. As we look at optimization and planning, be very deliberate about greenhouse gas and the footprint that we have. As I said, the design of the plant right now, the design basis of the plant right now is it's carbon neutral. As we go forward, we want to continue to improve upon that. Look at integration of cellulosic and other feedstocks in the plant. Again, because we have 24 fermenters, as opposed to a typical 100 million gallon plant with 4 or 5, we think, through discussions with some of those that are developing the technology, that we are uniquely suited for integrating commercial scale cellulosic while at the same time continuing with corn-based. And doing it in kind of a measured step-by-step way as opposed to full in. And honestly, that's one of the challenges that at least I have found in talking to technology providers. In fact, just in the last month, had a very in-depth discussion with one of the gentlemen from ESF, where they want to build pilot plants, and they want to build the pilot plants as a standalone entity and a standalone plant and develop commercially standalone. And I don't think that's the way to go. If you look at the hundreds of existing corn-based plants, for that technology to go, they've got to figure out a way to do it so they can introduce it in phases to the existing facilities that are out there operating now. Or I don't think it will happen. I think we're uniquely suited for that kind of an approach. We'll see. Advanced transportation alternatives. This is huge, right? Our plant is, it is complex. It's a living machine. You've got biology, you've got chemistry, you've got thermodynamics. The biggest aspect of this plant when it's up and running steady state is logistics. And if you think about cellulosic technology, it's logistics. With the hundreds of thousands of bushels of corn coming in, CO2, ethanol, distillers grains, corn syrup, biodiesel going off the site, it is a logistics operation to keep the material moving. It's huge. Improve risk management strategies, right? You need the bean counters. You need the guys who understand futures and hedging, and derivatives and all that. So biology, chemistry, thermodynamics, and derivatives. Academic research partnerships, we see this as critical and key to us. Not only as we look at alternatives and developing future, but going somewhat to your point, the talent and the kids that you need to get in to get them to understand and to help and to grow. That's an essential piece, and we see it as an essential piece of our future going forward. meaningful job creation. I don't know, again, I don't know how many of you are from around this region or how many of you have been through Oswego County lately, but it's in a sad state of affairs. You go through Fulton, right? At one time you had Miller, you had Nestle, you had, there are literally dozens of companies that used to make the Fulton area, Fulton/Oswego area, pretty active and viable. It's a sad, sad thing when you drive through town now and company after company after company after company is gone, buildings sitting there idle, windows boarded up, kids standing on the corner looking for work. So we think that this is part of us, and not just directly at the plant. When the pro forma was done for the facility, as I said, we had 67 people peak when we were attempting to operate before. I think when we come back, it'll be in the same neighborhood. But they estimated spin-off jobs and total impact from this plant somewhere in the neighborhood of about 2,000 jobs. 2,000. And that's what's going to happen. To survive, it's got to stand on its own merits, in the absence of subsidies, tariffs, and the other layers that always come to bear, because that's what feeds the argument. The margins have got to be clean margins. People have got to understand, right? Unlike what happened to commodities before, where it was people with paper driving the market. It wasn't the consumer that caused the price of food to go up. It wasn't, meaning consumer, it wasn't the consumer being ethanol causing the price of corn, which caused a loaf of bread to go up. It had nothing to do with it. It had to do with the guys, right, that understand the derivatives and the hedges and all that stuff, sitting in an office with a laptop buying hundreds of thousands of millions of gallons, bushels, whatever it was, and making the price go. There was a time during that period last year where speculators owned more corn on paper than any of the ethanol plants did, in aggregate. That's what caused the price to go up, along with gasoline and natural gas. It wasn't the consumer and the typical model that you would see, supply and demand. I'm done. Thank you.